Now, the American Supreme Court has ruled against American President Donald Trump's global tariffs, marking a major setback for executive power in trade policy. The top court has said that the tariffs were enacted under a federal law that was meant for national emergencies. The White House has offered no immediate response to the Supreme Court ruling. Trump, in fact, labelled it a complete disgrace moments after learning of the decision during a meeting with the governors. Now, more than $175 billion in U.S. tariff collections are at risk of having to be refunded. The importers are expected to scramble for the refunds from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency on import duties paid over the past year. And these tariffs that were enacted under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act have prompted extensive litigation and debate over whether a president can levy broad import duties without explicit congressional authorization. Now, Trump has in fact touted the revenue generated by all of his tariffs, estimated by the Congressional Budget Office at about $300 billion annually over the next decade. But the estimates show that a substantial amount may need to be refunded if the court rules against Trump.
What's happening, people? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast again. In a single week, Trump faced multiple 6-3 Supreme Court rulings against him, delivered by justices he himself appointed, including a conservative supermajority he helped shape. The president, who thought he'd built an impenetrable legal fortress, discovered his power stops at the courtroom door, and even his own picks have constitutional limits. Now, I want you to understand the full scale of what happened here, because this was not just one bad ruling on one bad afternoon. This was a legal avalanche, a cascade of defeat that would have ended most political careers in any other era. We are talking about multiple courtrooms, multiple jurisdictions, multiple layers of the judicial system, all converging on the same man at the same time with the same message. You have overstepped your authority. You have exceeded your constitutional bounds.
Now, after the Supreme Court ruling, refunds of $175 billion would exceed the combined fiscal 2025 outlay from the Department of Transportation at $127.6 billion and the Department of Justice at $44.9 billion. Now, these tariffs imposed by the American president have affected multiple nations, including India, which after a trade deal is paying 18% tariffs. Indonesia has got a tariff rate of 19%, Pakistan at 19%, Bangladesh again at 19%. China has a tariff rate of 37%, Vietnam has 20%, the EU has 15%, and Brazil has 50%. Now, importers from these nations have paid duties that could now return to them through claims processes. Legal teams are preparing for the next steps as the government is assessing compliance. Markets are monitoring the effects on trade flows and federal budgets ahead. But the question now is, what are Donald Trump's options? He can still wield tariff authority through Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962.
And we are not going to let you get away with it. Think about the sheer volume of these rulings. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that Trump's executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship was unconstitutional, a ruling that directly challenges 150 years of settled constitutional law. The same court refused to overturn the civil judgment finding that Trump sexually abused writer E. Jean Carroll, leaving that $5 million jury award completely intact and forcing the president to confront personal accountability that he has spent years trying to escape. The justices also struck down a Mississippi law that would have allowed states to refuse to count mail-in ballots arriving after Election Day, a decision that has massive implications for how voting works across 30 states.
And the act targets national security threats and Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 that is aimed at unfair trade practices. And we earlier spoke with Mr. Mark Brolin, who's a geoeconomic and geopolitical strategist and author. Listening to what he had to say.
Well, I think it's both predictable and less predictable. Betting markets have been anticipating this, but still, given that it goes across what Trump wants, it's a surprise in that sense. So White House will be fuming, but I still think in the big scheme of things, this will be a great positive. It will be positive for the free trade across the world, of course, but this also normalizes the relationship between the White House and Congress. So going back to how it usually is the case, that the White House suggests and then the Congress decides. And I think lots of the Republicans, they will have to pretend they're upset, but I think many Congress Republicans will be secretly happy about this too, because it makes them more powerful. And it also makes perhaps the Republican Party.
And then there was the federal judge in a completely separate case who ruled that Trump can be held personally liable in a civil lawsuit over the January 6th attack, finding that his speech at the Ellipse was a political act and not a protected presidential duty. As if that was not enough, another federal judge froze his entire reciprocal tariff scheme, saying he misused emergency powers that actually belong to Congress, not the presidency. Are you kidding me? That is a lot of losing in a very short period of time. That is a whole lot of constitutional walls being erected around a president who thought he could do whatever he wanted. And this is the part I need you to pay very close attention to, because it changes everything about how we understand this presidency.
Come across as more serious and responsible going forward, because I think many in the public, even within the MAGA movement, have not really liked all these executive orders, including the tariff executive orders. Well, there will be lots of huffing and puffing, of course, and the Trump administration, they will hit back at this and do all sorts of things the legal way, but probably not. They will probably not get so. They will try to save face that way. I'm not sure things will change from this. This is probably going to stand, and then there will be lots of discussions about the rebates if the money has to be paid back. So that will be a big story for a long time as well. But besides that, this certainly diminishes Team Trump in a way. I think we can see even before the Greenland episode, that was sort of a turning point. His power has now peaked. He did have more power than presidents usually had because of his style in a way. So he's not a lame duck yet. He might be after the November election, but his peak power is behind him. And from now on, he will not be taken as seriously. People already are not as afraid of him, even within his own party, as they have been in the past. So this is just like the Greenland setback for him. This is a setback as well.
These losses did not happen in left-leaning districts with activist judges looking to make a political statement. These losses happened in the Supreme Court, a court that Trump himself helped reshape. They happened in federal courts with judges who were appointed by presidents from both parties. They happened in institutions that Trump has spent years trying to bend to his will. And they still drew the line. They still said no. They still enforced the Constitution against a president who seems to believe that the Constitution is just a suggestion. And here is why this moment is genuinely different from every other bad week Trump has had over the years. Because Trump has had bad weeks before. He has survived scandals and investigations and impeachments and everything else that would have destroyed any other politician in American history. But what is happening right now in the courts is fundamentally different, because these are not political attacks. These are not partisan hearings. These are not congressional investigations that can be dismissed as witch hunts. These are constitutional limits being drawn by judges, including judges who have been friendly to Trump, including judges who were appointed by Trump, including judges who have given him major wins in the past. And those judges are now saying that there are lines even a president cannot cross. The lines they are drawing right now are around some of the most fundamental things in American life. Who counts as a citizen? How elections get run? Whether a president can be held personally responsible for what he says and does. These are not minor procedural questions. These are the kind of questions that define what kind of country this is, what kind of democracy we have, and whether the rule of law actually means anything, or whether it is just whatever the president says it is. Now let me take you inside Trump's response to all of this, because this is where the story gets genuinely wild. Instead of accepting these rulings, instead of acknowledging the constitutional limits that have been placed on his power, instead of understanding that even the highest court in the land has said he went too far, Trump went on Truth Social and posted that dumb judges and justices will not a great country make. Are you seriously kidding me? The President of the United States losing case after case in the nation's highest court, and his response is to go online and call the justices dumb. This is absolutely wild, because some of these justices are people he personally put on the bench during his first term. He nominated them, he championed them, he celebrated their confirmations like they were personal victories. He spent years pointing to them as proof that his legacy would endure, that his appointments would protect his agenda and shield him from accountability. And they still ruled against him on some of the biggest questions of his presidency. That tells you something very important. It tells you that even within a court system that has been reshaped significantly in Trump's favor over the past decade, there are constitutional lines that a majority of justices are not willing to let him cross, regardless of who appointed them. And when a president calls those justices dumb for enforcing the Constitution he swore to uphold, that says everything you need to know about how he really feels about limits on his power. This is not a man who respects the separation of powers. This is not a man who understands that the Constitution exists to restrain presidents. This is a man who views the courts as obstacles to be overcome, judges as obstacles to be insulted, and the Constitution itself as something that should bend to his will. And here is the other layer to this story that I need you to grasp before we go any deeper, because this is where the narrative gets more complicated and infinitely more interesting. Trump did not walk away from this stretch of court decisions completely empty-handed. In one significant ruling, the Supreme Court actually expanded his power to fire members of independent federal agencies. That is a real win. It gives him real new authority over the administrative state that no president has had since 1935. So this is not a simple story of Trump losing everything in court. It is a more complicated and honestly more revealing story than that. It is a story about a court that is willing to give Trump more structural power over the machinery of government while simultaneously refusing to let him use that power to change the fundamental rules of American democracy or escape personal accountability for his own actions. That is a very specific and very important set of lines that the judiciary has drawn. And today we are going to go through all of it clearly so you understand exactly what these rulings mean and why they matter so much. Let's start with birthright citizenship because this one is genuinely historic, and I do not think it is getting the attention it deserves. Trump signs an executive order trying to end birthright citizenship, meaning he tries to use a single presidential order to change who gets to be an American citizen at birth. Think about the magnitude of what he was attempting here. This is something that has been settled constitutional law for over 100 years. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution says that nearly all children born on American soil are citizens. That is not a gray area. That is not an open question. Legal scholars across the political spectrum have agreed on this for generations. And Trump signs an order saying he wants to change it just like that with a pen. No constitutional amendment, no act of Congress, just an executive order. And the Supreme Court 6-3 said no, absolutely not. You cannot do that. The 14th Amendment means what it says, and a president does not get to rewrite it by himself. This is wild because this was not a close call. This was not a narrow 5-4 decision on a genuinely contested legal question. 6 justices, including conservatives, looked at what Trump was trying to do and said it is unconstitutional. Full stop. And that matters enormously because it draws a very clear line around what executive power actually is and what it is not. A president cannot rewrite the Constitution with a pen, and the court just said that louder than it has been said in a very long time. Now let's talk about E. Jean Carroll, because this one is personal in a way that the birthright ruling is not. The background here is that a jury in 2023 found that Trump sexually abused Carroll and then defamed her when he denied it. The jury awarded her roughly $5 million. Trump has been fighting that judgment ever since, trying every legal avenue available to get it thrown out or reduced or delayed. And in this latest round, the Supreme Court refused to touch it. They would not overturn the judgment. They would not send it back for reconsideration. The Carroll judgment stands. And yeah, I know some people are going to say that is just a civil case and not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. But here is why it matters for this specific story. Trump has spent years arguing that he is essentially untouchable. That between presidential immunity and friendly courts and endless appeals, nothing will ever actually stick to him in a meaningful way. And the Carroll decision is the court saying no. Sometimes things stick. Sometimes the accountability is real. And a sitting president cannot make a civil judgment for sexual abuse and defamation simply disappear just because he keeps fighting it. And then there is the mail-in ballot ruling. And this one has implications that go way beyond this particular case. And I think it is one of the most underreported decisions of the whole stretch. The issue was a Mississippi law that would have allowed states to refuse to count mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day, even if they were postmarked before the deadline. Meaning you did everything right. You filled out your ballot, you sent it in on time, but because the Postal Service was slow, your vote gets thrown in the trash. And Trump's team was pushing hard for this kind of rule. Because if the Supreme Court upheld it, the ruling could have affected voting rules in around 30 states. That is not a minor technical adjustment to how elections are run. That is a potential fundamental reshaping of how tens of millions of Americans cast their votes in every future election. And the justices struck it down, which means a sustained years-long push to use state-level laws to tighten mail-in voting rules in ways that could change election outcomes just hit a major constitutional wall. Think about what that actually means at scale. This was not just about Mississippi. This was about a legal strategy that, if it had succeeded, could have thrown out legal ballots across the country, and the court said no. Now let's talk about January 6th, because the civil liability ruling from the federal judge is something that I think has not gotten nearly enough attention in the coverage of this week. A federal judge ruled that Trump can be held personally liable in a civil lawsuit related to the January 6th attack. The key question in the case was whether his speech at the Ellipse, the one where he told the crowd to march to the Capitol, was an official presidential act protected by immunity, or whether it was a political act that he can be held accountable for like any private citizen. And the judge ruled it was a political act, not a protected presidential duty, which means the lawsuit can move forward and Trump faces real personal legal exposure in a civil case directly connected to January 6th. Are you kidding me? Because Trump's entire legal strategy around January 6th has been built heavily on the argument that what he did was part of his official role as president and therefore protected. And a federal judge just said no to that in a significant and specific way. And then there is the tariff ruling, which is maybe the most economically consequential of everything that happened this week, but has gotten somewhat buried under the more dramatic constitutional headlines. Trump tried to use emergency powers to impose sweeping new global tariffs. Reciprocal tariffs, he called them, a signature piece of his second-term economic agenda. The idea was to hit countries that have trade surpluses with the United States with matching tariffs as a way to force better trade deals and bring manufacturing back home. Trump has been talking about this kind of economic strategy for years, and a federal judge froze. The entire scheme just stopped it cold. The judge's reasoning was clear and direct, and it is worth understanding specifically, tariff authority belongs primarily to Congress under the Constitution, not to the president. Congress writes trade law, Congress sets tariff policy, and what Trump was trying to do was use emergency powers to grab that authority for the executive branch and impose tariffs that Congress had not specifically authorized. The judge said that is not how emergency powers work. You cannot declare a trade emergency and then use that declaration to take over congressional authority over trade policy indefinitely. This is wild because trade and economic nationalism have been at the absolute center of Trump's political identity for years. This is one of the things his base is most passionate about, and a federal judge just said the way he has been trying to do it exceeds his constitutional authority, and it has to stop while the legal challenge plays out. Now, here is the thing I want you to hold on to as we head into the final analysis. Trump did get one significant win in this same stretch of court decisions. The Supreme Court expanded his power to fire members of independent federal agencies, overturning a 1935 precedent and giving him sweeping control over regulatory bodies like the Federal Trade Commission. That is a real win. It gives him meaningful new authority over the administrative state. But even with that win, the overall picture of this week is one where the court drew sharp, specific constitutional limits around what he can and cannot do. They gave him more power in one lane while slamming the door in several other very important lanes. And that combination, winning on regulatory power while losing on citizenship, elections, personal accountability, and emergency economic powers, tells a story about exactly where this presidency stands legally right now. All right, let's break this all the way down now, because after everything we just went through, I want to land on what this all actually means in plain terms. What it means for Trump, what it means for the country, and what it means for everything that comes next. The myth that Trump stacked the courts and is now untouchable is officially dead. And this needs to be said clearly and directly, because it has been one of the dominant narratives in American politics for years, and this week punched a very large hole in it. For years, one of the central ideas around Trump's legal strategy has been that by appointing 3 Supreme Court justices and hundreds of federal judges during his first term, he essentially insulated himself and his agenda from judicial pushback. The idea was that the courts he reshaped would broadly support what he tried to do and broadly protect him from accountability when he crossed legal lines. And that idea has taken a serious, specific, documented hit this week because the birthright ruling was 6-3, 6 justices. That is not a narrow partisan split. That means conservative justices voted against him on one of his signature executive orders. The mail-in ballot ruling went against him. The Carroll judgment was allowed to stand in full. The January 6th civil liability case was allowed to move forward. The tariff scheme was frozen. These are not the outcomes you get from a court system that is rubber stamping everything a president pushes through. These are outcomes from courts at multiple levels, drawing real constitutional lines and enforcing them even when the president on the other side of those lines spent years trying to reshape those very courts. The idea that you can appoint your way to total legal invincibility just got a very loud, very public reality check from the institutions Trump was counting on most. Trump's biggest losses this week are all about personal accountability, and that is not an accident. Think about what the 3 biggest defeats actually have in common. The Carroll ruling means he cannot escape a civil judgment for personal conduct. The January 6th civil liability ruling means he cannot hide behind presidential immunity for what he said at the ellipse. And the birthright ruling means he cannot use executive power to change the fundamental rules about who gets to be American just because he personally wants to. Every single one of these is about limits on what Trump can do as an individual, either as a private person being held accountable for his actions, or as a president trying to use his office to impose personal policy preferences in ways the Constitution does not allow. And his response to those limits, calling judges and justices dumb on Truth Social, shows exactly how he feels about the idea of accountability. He does not accept it. He never has. But the courts are imposing it anyway. And that matters enormously for where this goes from here, because the accountability is not going away just because Trump is angry about it online. This week proves that courts can still function as a check on executive power even in a highly politicized environment. And I think this might be the most important takeaway of everything we covered today. Because one of the biggest fears about American democracy over the last several years has been that the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, has become so politicized that it can no longer function as a genuine independent check on the executive branch. And what happened this week does not completely eliminate that concern, but it does something important. It shows that even in a court reshaped significantly by one president's appointments, there are constitutional lines that a majority of justices are not willing to cross regardless of who is asking them to cross it. 6 justices said birthright citizenship is protected by the 14th Amendment and a president cannot change that with a pen. Multiple justices refused to let personal legal judgments against Trump simply disappear. A federal judge froze a major economic policy initiative by saying the president does not have the authority he claimed. These are institutions doing their jobs imperfectly, with plenty of problems still remaining, but doing their jobs, and right now in this political environment, that is not a small thing. Trump won a structural win on firing agency heads, but lost decisively on birthright citizenship, election rules, personal accountability, and tariffs, all from the court he helped shape. He may rage on Truth Social, but the rulings stand. And the real story is a president learning that even his own justices draw lines between executive power and constitutional limits.